Hello, Internet. In today's study on interesting history, we're going to be in the small southern German city of Constance in the year 1414, where a man rose in the great city hall and declared the ecumenical meeting of the church open. It would take 4 years fighting inside the meeting hall with the cardinals and a German king promising to horsewhip every last one of them before the meeting was be able to close again. Then again, it's not every day the church have to figure out what to do with all three popes they currently have on their hands. So yeah, enjoy. So how did it get to that? Well, we need to begin in 1307, where Philippe the Beautiful, or Philip the Good of France, destroyed the Knight Templar order. For some years, Philip, who owed the knights a great deal of money, have wanted to deal with them. But, of course, you don't just declare war on what is both the most famous order of holy knights in the Western and Christian world, but also a fairly powerful state within a state that can possibly even resist your most potent of armies. To do that, you need to be subtle, and you need papal support. However, Philip was nothing if not determined, and after a few years where various popes died suddenly and mysteriously, he succeeded in having his own candidate elected, and very, very shortly after he struck, the Knight Templars was destroyed. This, however, for the Council of Constance was only a sort of distant beginning. What really mattered was that the popes under French control moved to Avignon from Rome and there sat for almost 70 years in the papal palace, completely under French dominion, which of course helped the French during political issues, but also put the popes in a very strange position where they were almost seen as tools rather than as Christian pontiffs. Then, 70 years later, in 1377, the then sitting Pope Gregory XI decided to return the pontiff seat to Rome. He moved himself and all the papal court back to the Vatican, but died shortly afterwards. Another pope, Urban VI, was elected, but a large group of church lords, particularly a lot of French church lords and cardinals, then gathered back together in Avignon because they didn't like him and elected anti-pope Clement II, who then sat at Avignon like they had for a while. That, of course, split Europe between the popes, which also, you can imagine, worsened the secular diplomatic situation of a Europe that was already riveted at the time by the 100 Years' War and various other situations. England, Germany, most of the Nordic supported the Pope in Rome, while French, Spaniards, and certain Italians decided that the Avignon Pope was the one to deal with. This lasted for a while, but in 1409 a council was then held at Pisa to trying to fix the situation by determining the correct pope. They decided that none of the sitting popes at the time was probably the right one and elected their own. So, yeah, since none of the others had promised to abdicate or anything, we now had three popes to deal with. This was not an improvement. Shortly after Pisa, however, Sigismund, the king of Hungary, also became king of Germany and decided that his goal for the future was become Holy Roman Emperor. However, to do that, of course, he needed united papal support, and especially since he also needed to deal with some rebellion Hungarian Hussites, religious followers of the church reformer Jan Hus. So, what to do? Well, another council obviously had to be called. Sigismund had support from such prominent church leaders as Jean Chasson and Pierre Daly in France, and eventually in 1414 the Council of Constance was called to decide what to do with John the 23rd, Gregory the 12th, and Benedict the 13th, and hopefully finally bring the Great Western Schism under control and reunite the Catholic Church. The council itself was held in Sigismund's territories in Constance, in south of Germany, a small town of about 4,000 inhabitants, which nearly doubled in size as 600 meeting participants plus servants, soldiers, various dependents, visitors, and other associates arrived. Evil rumors will know that eventually there were more prostitutes in town than there had originally been women. However, that might just be typical medieval propaganda. For the first long while, the council itself had great difficulties getting things done. Oh, there were talkings and discussions, and everyone was united in trying to figure out what to do. The problem was that France and England was fighting the 100 Years' War, so they were not quite as keen on cooperating, especially since one of the most powerful French noblemen had allied with the English against their own insane king. Also, Sigismund was fighting with the Italian city-states. The various popes were fighting with each other. Basically, the first year or year and a half or so was utter chaos, with at one point Sigismund storming out of the meeting shouting to the world, "They will give me an Italian pope, those cardinals. By God, I will horsewhip them all before seeing it happen." In 1415, however, the British defeated the French at Agincourt, and the peace treaty afterwards led to, if not friendlier relationships between those two countries, but a strengthened alliance between the English and the Germans. And also at this point the discussions had reached the point where two of the three sitting popes, Gregory and John, agreed to abdicate and step down. At this point, the council decided to try to focus on reforming the church internally, while Sigismund diplomatically tried to work with France and Spain to remove support from the remaining antipope, Benedict. It was also at this point that he achieved a certain degree of success, though it would later come back to bite him in the ass, when the council summoned Jan Hus to be tried for heresy, and despite giving him a promise of free passage, burned him at the stake. This, as you can imagine, did not sit well with his followers, and Sigismund would in fact spend almost the entire rest of his career fighting Hussite rebellions in his hard lands of Hungary. However, it did provide him with a immediate boost of popularity, and with the French internal problems papered over and the English and German and northern nations uniting in a stronger alliance, it did give Sigismund enough clout that by 1470 he had managed to politically isolate Benedict the 13th enough that even though he refused to step down and sought refuge with some Catalan noblemen who were still following, the council could agree to basically ignore him and elect Martin V as the new unopposed single pope of the Catholic Church. The council at this time tried to turn to internal reforms of the more obvious deficiencies within the church. However, Martin, who had, after all, just been elected as the United Pope, were more interested in re-establishing full papal authority, and despite the reform movement desperately trying to tell him that either we did something or there would be big problems down the line, it eventually subsided, and in 1418 the meeting finally came to a close and everyone left to go home. And finally, a couple of years later, Martin could crown Sigismund as the Holy Roman Emperor. So, success! or what? So why exactly was the Council of Constance so interesting? Well, first of all, obviously, it ended the Great Schism, which has torn Europe into two, well, in fact, three for a short while, for almost 100 years. Well, more than 100 years, actually. It also was the first time during the council history that the national voting blocks became a thing. Usually, it just meant that the individual cardinals voted and spoke in whatever alliances they decided might be proper. This time, however, people voted with the nations they sat from, which also meant, of course, that since the English cardinals altogether had one vote, they mattered as much as the French cardinals and the Italian cardinals and the Spanish cardinals and so on, which meant that the Italians couldn't dominate as they always had, because there were about as many of them as there was of anyone else during the entire council. Combining this with the famous Haec Sancta resolution the council adopted in 1415, which stated that during crisis of the church and in moral and ordinary questions, the council itself would actually stand above the pope, because the church as a body had greater authority than any single bishop of Rome or otherwise. It created the height of the conciliary movement that would turn the church from a single man rule, as it has become, into a more of a conciliary movement where everything was to be determined in council and with all the people having something to say. This might in fact have turned the Catholic Church into an early sort of democracy. This failed, of course, when Martin re-established full papal authority, but it's interesting to note that a lot of the reforms that this council was working with might in fact possibly have stopped the Reformation 100 years later dead, if the council had allowed, or been allowed, to establish these reforms as fact, and also to create a overarching authority that wasn't depending on just the given beliefs of the Pope at any given time. Many of the issues that Martin Luther and other later reformers and Reformation leaders were complaining about were actually being discussed at the Council of Constance, but never, of course, adopted in the end. And there we are. The Great Council of Constance, who succeeded strongly in its primary goal of reuniting the Catholic Church, but failed in its stated goal of also trying to, modernize it, reform it, and make it something that could last unopposed. In many ways, you can actually see this council as sort of the forerunner for the secularization of the Europe that had otherwise been crushed in the last couple of centuries, but would later find its greatest achievements during the Renaissance and later modern period. In some ways, you can say that depending on how you look at it, the way the council was set up in nation voting blocks, this could be seen as a sort of very early point of when nationalism as a concept started to have actual meaning in Europe for the first time, basically since the fall of the Roman Republic. So basically a very interesting place. If you want to know more, I would suggest you read either Crowder and his Unity, Heresy and Reform, or Loomis and his The Council of Constance and the Reunification of the Church. Or perhaps even, if you can handle a bit of Latin or find a decent translation, go directly to Jean Chasson himself, who had his diary published. He was a participant in the meeting and a leading reformer of his time. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. Next time we return to history, we will talk about one of the greatest Danish Viking families, Ragnar Lothbrok and his sons. We will be in Paris, we will be in England, we will be in Scandinavia, and we will have a poem about pigs. Until then, I have been the Sage, and have a good day.